Patty, I thought our episode today was one of the most interesting conversations that we've had.
I think it rates way up there, James. I mean, I was just like enamored with me and Dad. So
yeah, I knew you would love this episode for sure. I would love it as much as you did, but I think I did actually.
Yeah, I think I learned so much from him, and I know you did too. And I think our listeners are really going to enjoy this. I think they're going to come away from this interview with some real actionable information.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, in this episode, we're going to be talking about retention. That's plain and simple, and how to actually predict which merchants are highly likely to cancel. And then Patty, you shared some really great data in the insiders.
Some really great data about the transition away from traditional card payments to more digital forms of payments. There's a lot of activity out there. There's a lot of consumer demand. And James, I thought your question from the field really dovetailed well with our interview. You want to give everybody a little snippet of that?
Yeah, so I talk about the most underrated component of agent compensation. I'm actually not going to talk about it because I don't want to spoil it, because it's not what you think. And if you're an agent and right now you're thinking, okay, is it the Schedule A cost? Is it the residual split? Is it the upfront bonuses? It's none of those things. So it's the most underrated component of agent compensation. That's what I talk about there. Our sponsor for this podcast is Valor Paytech, the leader in processor agnostic omni-channel terminal and gateway technology. They have a fantastic virtual terminal, fantastic physical terminal. They specialize in cash discounting. So definitely check them out. Go to ccsalespro.com/Valor, VALOR.
Okay, James, so you ready to go into the podcast?
Let's do it.
Welcome to the Merchant Sales Podcast.
Everybody, Patty and I are here today with Sebastian. He is the CEO and co-founder of Arkham Partners. How are you doing today, Sebastian?
Pretty good, James. Pretty good. How you doing, Patty? It's really, really good to be here.
Oh, great to have you. Great to have you. I love this topic we're going to do today. It's one of those topics that I can really sink my teeth into.
Yes, Patty is our resident data expert. So we're going to be talking about big data. Sebastian has really created an interesting niche working with a lot of the large processing companies to help them leverage their big data to predict attrition, to help them retain customers. And so before we dive into all that though, Sebastian, we have to get your story. I got a little bit of it as I talked to some people that we had mutual connections, but I want our audience to hear it. So how did you get into this crazy industry? And then how did you end up founding Arkham Partners?
Man, I always have this saying that, you don't choose payments chooses you.
Correct.
And during my short tenure, it kind of started, going back, I go back to grad school where this is pretty much where I started getting the data bug. And, as an applied economist, it's pretty much about how do you leverage data modeling traditionally in economics to pretty much make business decisions. Mm-hmm. So these were, this is kind of my first time where I was exposed to the tools available to solve business problems using and leveraging data. Shortly after, I actually, went to work and did a lot of this for, the publication industry. In fact, churn is obviously a problem in that industry, as you can imagine. But shortly after, when I, went on to come into the payments industry with, probably one of the biggest processors in the game, I came back to this problem. This is also a problem that was present in the payments industry. And from that point on, I almost became obsessed with it. I was lucky enough that I had the opportunity to play around with almost, 500,000 merchants globally. So this is where the precursors or the initial models that I built came from, and a lot of my experimentation and even, initial insights really stemmed from this exposure. So shortly after, I didn't have any kids, didn't have any, a wife, not even a girlfriend at the time. So I said, well, I love this problem. No one seems to be trying to solve it. So let me go ahead and go and swim against the current and try to do, something very challenging, which is, obviously, in a way, it's predicting the future, a future that hasn't occurred. And again, having the tools and having been exposed to how those tools are applied to business settings, it became a no-brainer. And, to be honest, I thought this was going to be relatively easy. It's like, I got the data already, I got the expertise. Yeah, let's dive in and solve it. And no, it actually, it took a while to get it right. It
Sure.
took a while to get the methodology right, but today, almost 3 years later, I would say, we have analyzed over 200,000 merchants across the U.S. and in total, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere around $150 billion in processing volume that has gone through our algorithm. So we have gotten better. By no means is by no means is it the true final answer. I think it's a work in progress, and we can only hope to get better and better through time.
Sure.
I love that. It's like, oh, I didn't have any kids or a girlfriend. I got all this time on my hands. I'm just going to start crunching numbers.
I had some money too, I'm not going to lie, Patty. It was like coming out,
Right?
you realize like, I don't need all this money. Let me start something. And I always wanted to. So, again, stumbling upon this problem was probably one of the greatest blessings and curses, I would say, because now it's like I'd be thinking about this day and night, and obviously how do we improve and how do we get better at it.
Sure. Can I have to ask you though, how long did it take before you started addressing the problem to when you could actually go out and say, here's something I can offer you?
I'll tell you this, Patty. I had enough savings for about a year initially, and I said, there's more than enough time. And little did I know, it was actually going to take us about a year to get our hands on our first data set to actually start experimenting and really, really hammering the problem. So it's been a long road, but honestly, all the pain, suffering, once you get the results, it's almost like, wow, I knew it. I knew this could work. I always knew it.
Right.
And it's so refreshing, it's kind of worth every single ounce of pain you experience through the journey. It's totally worth it,
Yeah.
I love it. The classic entrepreneurial story. I've experienced the same thing, several times of, thinking like, oh, this is, like the business right now that we're scaling up is our, ISO AMP, which is our automated statement analysis, and so I thought like, oh, I know statement analysis. Like, how hard can this be? 1.5 million later, it's like, oh man, we're still getting this, just still tweaking it. It's like, so I get it. Okay, so let's talk about attrition, and how big of a problem is this in our industry? And when I say our industry here, Sebastian, I'm talking about the ISOs that in our audience we have, the independent agent model or the W-2, but it's direct sales ISOs. How big of a problem is attrition for our industry, especially in light of PayFacs and ISVs and these kind of new like external disruptors and competitors that we have today?
I would say it's a huge problem, and it's present by, whether you're a small ISO or the biggest processor in the game. This is a problem present across the board. To give you some stats, roughly, over 20% of merchants are expected to leave every single year. That's 1 in 5 merchants. That's a big number. Yeah. Imagine, 1 out of every processing merchant, out of every 5 processing merchants leaves your portfolio. Now you're in a constant rat race of trying to compete. And obviously, as competition gets more fearsome from bigger tech players that like Square coming into the game, this is only going to become exacerbated over the long run,
Sure. I'm curious though, as you were building your data models, what did you uncover to be sort of the key drivers of attrition?
I love this question, Patty. Yeah, I can tell you're the data liaison.
I'm the data.
So actually, we pretty much both. Obviously, you get a processing file and you get over 300 different columns or data fields, as we call them. And it was interesting enough. We were able to pretty much boil it down to 5 main reasons as to why a merchant may leave. A lot of people think it's pricing, to be honest, and the truth is, pricing is a component, but it's not the main driver. You have agents or partners that could be taking their portfolio elsewhere, so therefore leaving you behind. The other reason we identified is service. A lot of times merchants may have bad service or multiple experiences where service was just lagging, and obviously they don't have the agents are constantly calling them to switch and save on money. So obviously service is a big thing. The other thing I would say is product. Product in many times is, not ideal for that particular merchant or vertical. And therefore, when someone comes into your door and asks and proposes or offers you a better product for your specific business, then you're more likely to leave. Additionally, we uncovered, the economy. So we get information about the zip 5 level. So we can get very granular as to what's the economy. Plus, we use a lot of proprietary data sets to enhance the payments data that we get in order to really determine whether this is a macro driver or rather an internal driver of attrition. And last but not least, obviously, it's pricing. Obviously, pricing is a big component as well as to why a merchant may leave. And, they're constantly have to understand that in this industry, merchants are constantly getting haggled up. Hey, I can save you and cut your processing rate. So as you can imagine, this is, it's not one single answer. I would say it's a composition of those 5 reasons that I just mentioned.
Did any of those things or anything else really surprise you, when you started doing this analysis?
Yeah, to be honest, I was expecting, I must have spoken to God, maybe hundreds, if not more than that, executives, customer relationships manager, and they always go back to, it's pricing. It's always pricing. Of course it's pricing. But it was very interesting to find out, actually, no, a lot of the drivers of attrition are internally, like your agent, he gets offered a better split by a bigger guy. And obviously, instead of taking his entire book immediately, no, he starts taking it slowly because maybe he doesn't want to ruin that relationship with the processor. Maybe you offer him cash discounts and the new one he's going to does not. So he does not want to obviously limit his ability to find the right product or service for his merchants. So this is a slow attrition that occurs, and it's all driven internally. You wouldn't expect your agents or your partners to be doing this, but that is actually one of the main drivers of attrition that we see across the portfolios that we have analyzed. It stems from the agent a lot of times.
That's so interesting. And obviously the main reason that they would want to take them slowly is because almost every agent in the industry is under a very strict non-solicitation clause in the agreement, where it's technically illegal for them to move a merchant once they've placed it with a processor. And it's interesting, actually, like I'm imagining how my audience is receiving this interview. All of them right now are thinking, wait a second, are you telling me that you can identify the agents that are flipping the accounts? And so all the agents are hating you right now. All the ISOs are loving you. So
please, agents, don't hate me. I just crunch the numbers,
Yeah, he just crunches the numbers. He's not,
The agents are like, wait a minute, I've been sneaking around with this for years. What are you saying, So, okay, now there's one that you didn't mention though, Sebastian, and I'm really, really surprised actually. So talking about merchant size, I was under I understood that like if a merchant does less than 5,000 in volume versus they do over 100,000, I thought that there was like a massive like difference in retention. What's the deal with that?
Oh man, I love this question because it's actually like, it's very interesting. This is again, when you get to see sort of payment, like you have to know payments to be able to make sense of these insights, because, you can hire a data scientist who's never seen a single processing file, but the intricacies of the industry are only known by those who are in the industry,
Right.
So, you're absolutely right, James. On average, increase in processing volume actually reduces the probability of a merchant attriting. You're absolutely right by that. But I'll give you this caveat, when we hold price fixed, in other words, when the big merchant and the small merchant both have the same price, it's actually the larger merchants who have a higher likelihood of leaving. And the reason for that is, of course, as a large merchant, you have a lot of leverage with your processor. Someone offers you better rates, your processor is more likely to match those rates versus a small guy. Hey, it's just a small guy, let him leave. But when you have all things, when price is held, constant across the two merchants, bigger guys are actually more likely to leave than those smaller ones.
Really? That is so interesting. So let's.
What do you think the reason is for that? I'm sorry, James. Yeah.
Oh, no, go ahead.
What do you think the reason for that is, Sebastian?
The reason for that, honestly, I think that, the smaller guys don't get as much white glove treatment as the bigger accounts, I would say. And they're almost seen as, I'm not going to say, dispensable, but hey, there is a lot of these smaller guys in comparison to the big guys. So it's very easy, it actually makes perfect sense. If the majority of my revenue comes from, a small majority of the merchants, then I'm going to focus on that. I'm going to give my extreme attention to those particular merchants. But in reality, it's like if you peel the curtain back, you realize like there's those small, medium-sized merchants one day will become big merchants. So I would say it's in the best interest of every ISO and agent to never disregard that, and to build those relationships early on, because again, at one point, that small merchant is not going to remain small forever.
Right. But if the big merchant is getting kid gloves treatment, why would they leave?
Oh, well, there's always someone who will treat you better, Patty.
Okay. Gotcha. I kind of thought that was.
Well, I think this is so interesting, and I actually really want to dig into this for a second, Sebastian, because this is news to me, and I love this insight. So let me see if I can restate this and tell me if I'm understanding what you're saying. So what you're saying is, on face of it, 100,000 a month merchant versus a 5,000 a month merchant or 10,000, statistically, 100,000 merchant is less likely to trend, but the fact that it's 100,000 versus 10,000 is not actually the predictive. It's not the driver. What you're saying is that 100,000 merchant is more likely to have better service, potentially integration with technology, better pricing. And so it's actually these other things that, because they're a large merchant, as an industry, we've decided to treat them differently. And it's the way that we're treating them that's actually causing them to not attrit. Is that what you're saying?
100%, man. I couldn't have phrased it better. That is pretty much a spot on.
Wow. Okay. This is really, really interesting. Okay. So, all right. So I love this. This is interesting. So now let's move on to another really interesting topic here, which is integrated payments.
Right.
So of course you already mentioned this as far as the type of solution that they had. I'm just kind of curious, when you talk about a merchant account and they have integrated payments versus a standalone terminal or whatever. I mean, how big of a difference are you seeing with retention? What's the deal with that? How big of a driver is that?
So I'll be honest. So we, for the most part, in all the portfolios we've analyzed, probably about, 6 of them, we don't necessarily see if, okay, this guy has, Appetize, or this guy has a particular, POS system that, allows them to do, how do you call that? Inventory management and so forth. It's not very specific, but from the data that we see is we can see if the terminal is, has contactless payments or not, So we can actually use that as a proxy to, hey, this is a more sophisticated terminal than just your regular, X terminal that, exactly, that allows you to just accept the credit cards. So what we're actually seeing is that, across portfolios, those merchants with these, quote unquote, fancier terminals, the probability of leaving is actually reduced for anywhere between 4 to up to 6% in many cases. It really depends on the number changes from portfolio to portfolio, but it, in fact, is true. These type of the newer terminals do provide for a stickier product, and that's why I don't think that it's contactless payments per se that is helping these merchants retain or stay around for longer, but rather is that these terminals on average tend to be fancier and have more functionalities than other more traditional POS solutions.
And just to, again, kind of clarify a bit more there. So what you're saying is the data you have available to you on the 6 large portfolios you guys have looked at so far is you have contactless versus non-contactless. That's what you're talking about, but you haven't, and I understand that. So there's just the fact of saying they have contactless means they're more likely that they have a fancier terminal, so they're less likely to attrit. But have you seen data as far as they have a point of sale system versus a smart terminal, or you know what I mean, that kind of level, or is that not data that's been available?
No, that's sometimes, it really varies. The data we get varies from processor to processor, Right. And believe it or not, a lot of processors, sometimes we see whether, they have multiple terminals in the location or if they have a single terminal. But, in terms of specific functionalities of the terminal, we don't really see that data a lot.
Wow.
And for the most part, yeah. I mean, maybe it's not being tracked. I would encourage, your listeners, if, you're an ISO, that, hey, try to collect and as much information about your merchants and service and products as you can, because again, I'm no wizard. You know what I'm saying? We simply, in here, all we do is crunch the numbers and let the data tell the story. And if I don't have access to a specific variable or column, then I cannot infer anything. That's why when we say we use sort of that contactless payments as a proxy for whether this is a fancy terminal or not. Whether that does inventory management, we don't know. we can only infer that, hey, we see that contactless payments reduces the likelihood of attriting, but can we attribute that to, whether this is a X, Y, or Z terminal? We can't.
Right. That's so interesting. I mean, it's actually it's an interesting point that you can't make. It's like, really, that surprises me. So I feel like, if there's an ISO or processor out there, and it's like, if you don't have a column in your data set for full feature point of sale, or in some way, I think you want to quantify this merchant has payments integrated into the business operating system that they're using, right? So whatever that might be, if it's, it could be card not present and it's integrated with QuickBooks, or it could be card present and they've got their point of sale or whatever. But I think that's really interesting. Okay, so I think this is fascinating. I think all of our listeners realize at this point that you're able to kind of predict some of this. It's great. So tell us more about Arkham Partners. I'm assuming you only work with wholesale ISOs because you have to get this data. Like, tell us a little more about, like, who do you work with? How do you partner? Like, what's your place in the industry here, Sebastian?
Man, James, you have been very on point up to this point. Actually, no, it's not only wholesale ISOs. We work with retail ISOs all the time.
Really?
And yeah. I mean, retail ISOs do have access to this data from a lot of them. And to be quite honest, we, for the most part, we work with the smaller ISOs, not the big, large processors. And when we find the most interesting insights, usually come from these smaller guys because they get more creative. They collect more columns that the bigger guys maybe don't consider collecting. And that's what makes sort of this journey fascinating, because you see, sometimes we come across a portfolio that it's just 5,000 merchants or it's 3,000 merchants. But you see a column you've never seen before, and it's like, Jesus has come, It's like, this is fascinating,
Sure.
And I can't stress this enough. And it's like, it's not so much about the quantity of the data you collect. It's not, you can have 1 million observations, but if your portfolio has some restaurants and some e-commerce, and you treat the data that you're collecting from both of those merchants the same, then you're not going to see the intricacies that are present between restaurant or retail versus a, card not present type of merchant.
So if I understand correctly, what you're saying is, and I hadn't thought about that, I mean, that is interesting. There are a lot of retail ISOs, of course, that would have access to, a lot of data, right? Maybe not as much as some of the others, but I think that's super interesting. So you're working with a retail or wholesale ISO, doesn't matter. They have a portfolio, 3,000 plus mids, something like that. And what does this process look like? Are you kind of like tweaking your algorithm based on the data that they have available? And then talk about, like, what do they get out of this? Is there like a dashboard that says, here's the ones that are going to cancel that you should, that are a high likely to cancel? Like, tell us more about the actual,
or why they're going to cancel or something like that.
Yeah, no. So the process is, we're not that fancy yet, James. So, in fact, I usually just send an Excel sheet to say, hey, here are the mids that are leaving, some information about those mids, and then we give some reasons as to why those merchants are leaving. But we actually recently closed a financing round, so we are going that route. We are building these analytics into a dashboard to make it a lot more user-friendly for the retention managers that are going to be using this type of insights down the road. But it's a fairly straightforward process. We usually get the data from the ISO or acquirer, transfer that securely, obviously, and then we start custom tailoring. We have benchmark models, of course, but at the same time, the differences across portfolios are sometimes so unique, or portfolios maybe focus on one vertical versus the other. So every single model we built initially, it's taking that into consideration. So in a way, they are custom tailored to specifically fit the patterns that particular portfolio may fit in their client, in their client book, more or less.
Yeah, I love it. I really like what you're doing, Sebastian. It's these podcast episodes are always interesting to me because I learn new things, and I really think like what you're doing ultimately, like macro, everybody can win with this. It's kind of a thing where I feel like it could really provide an additional level of stability to the industry. Especially as the larger companies kind of take this on. And it's like, if they're putting those resources into retaining merchant accounts, all of a sudden we're not losing 20% of, there isn't this changing of hands every year. I think that's actually really, really interesting. Okay, last question here. Well, I guess I have two more. So what advice do you have? Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. I don't, but I actually want to also stress this point. You know, it's if 20% of your book is leaving, it's because again, you know, maybe there's something wrong. You know, it doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing. You know, but it gives you room for improvement, and I think that's all our product does. It highlights where you know there's opportunities for improving. You know, again, merchant services has the word service in it, and I can't tell you how many you know ISOs or acquirers are you know maybe not afraid but reluctant to call their merchants. So it's like you know all we're doing is sort of shining a light to the problem and say, hey, you know, but just spend more time with their merchants, help them. You are the payments expert, their advisor, like the consultant. There you go. You know, business as it is for a merchant is complicated enough. You know, don't make processing one of those additional problems. You know,
Right, right.
I like it. Okay, so I'm looking at my list here, and I had a few. I do want to dive into a couple of things, but I'm going to go kind of rapid fire here, Sebastian. Okay, so we're gonna, you know, you and I and Patty could talk for another couple hours, I'm sure, but our listeners might want us to wrap it up. So, all right. So, number one question is, what can we do about it? So, have you found any specific kind of like here are the actions you just mentioned? You know, spending more time. I mean, is that all it is? It's like just reach out. Like, what do we need to do about this when we find out, hey, this merchant's got a higher likelihood of attriting?
You know, I feel like you know this really depends on the type of merchant that we're talking about. You know, obviously a gas station merchant is going to need a completely different approach than a restaurant merchant, you know? So I would say, you know, it really does begin with just reaching out and seeing, okay, what are some of the pain points you're experiencing as a merchant? And from there, you know, really looking internally to determine whether, you know, what additional product offering, service offering do I have that I can solve these merchants' problems? I think that's where everything, you know, pretty much stems from, you know? Sometimes that can be achieved through a phone call and you get more information about exactly what is keeping this merchant awake at night. Many times it's just a simple matter of, hey, here's a new POS because I know that you're a restaurant, you don't have contactless payments, and this could really benefit your day-to-day operations in this COVID environment, for example. You know, so I think it's I don't want to give you one answer that applies to all merchants because again, every merchant is unique. But something that I can say it really does start with, you know, just reaching out and speaking with the merchant because they'll let you know what is wrong from the beginning, you know?
Sure.
So establishing and building and continuing to build upon that relationship is fundamental when it comes to being in this business.
So yeah, I love that. So I think, you know, for the larger processors and acquirers, I mean, I think this is a pretty straightforward thing. Like get you the data, you get them back this list of, you know, of mids that they should have their support team focus on. So that's a no-brainer. Let's talk about the other side though. So let's talk about the small ISO, meaning, you know, they've got, you know, 15, 20, 30 sales reps, maybe 100, but they've got these independent agents all over the place selling for them. What advice do you have if you give them kind of one quick piece of advice to, you know, maybe help with their issues of attrition?
Absolutely. So, you know, I think this is a twofold answer. You know, the first is obviously, you know, you're a small ISO, you know, maybe you don't have access to a fancy data team. Well, your processor does, you know, so maybe it starts with asking, you know, it begins with asking for help. You know, I can imagine, James, when you first began your entrepreneurial journey, you probably asked a lot of mentors, advisors for help, and they always guided you to the answer. You know, the same applies for the smaller ISOs. They are fundamental and critical for a lot of these larger organizations, and maybe where a small ISO may not be able to afford more advanced analytics, their processors certainly can, you know. So even asking for their processor to allow, hey, I need more access to my data. I would like these fancier tools to be used so I can help manage my book better. I'm pretty sure the processors will not be, you know, against providing such aid.
Sure.
Absolutely. And then going down to even just the individual agent that just, you know, feet on the street, they're the ones that are actually like interacting with these merchants. Any thoughts there for them, whether it's, you know, maybe the initial sale or it's after sale? I mean, what can they do to really help stem the tide of attrition on their own book?
I would say, again, you know, asking their ISO for help in that matter. You know, I've never been an agent. Actually, I did it for one day. I lied. Tough business, you know, it's a very tough. It's very tough, you know, and And as an agent, I can only imagine, I'm focused on bringing in accounts. I'm focused on building these relationships quickly with these merchants. And I don't have the time nor the bandwidth to think like, oh, now I got to go back to reach out to them again to ensure that relationship is intact. And this is where, again, payments it's an industry of data. We are swimming in data in this particular industry. So it really is a matter of, having, whether it's your bigger ISO, the processor, really asking them for the tools necessary to make your life easier as an agent, because again, you can't do it all. Yes, you're the first line of defense at any given moment. And if that is the case, then I would say, I couldn't stress this enough, ensure that you have the right tools to do the right job. Because at the end of the day, no one can really tell whether a merchant is unhappy or not. And the only way to do so is by, really leveraging technology and the power of relationships to really, really have a long-lasting book.
Yeah, love it. Yeah. Sebastian, this has been one of the more interesting conversations we've had on the podcast, I think. So I'm sure many of our listeners are going to want to learn more about you, about Arkham Partners. Where would you send them to learn more and inquire?
You can check us out at our website. That's arkhampartners.com. That's ARCUM partners.com. My email, Sebastian@arkhampartners.com, or honestly, LinkedIn. Or sometimes I had to take out the notifications there because it was driving me crazy. I was getting no work done, but yeah, I'm pretty reachable, man. And even if someone wants to ask a question or something like that, again, I'm always willing to kind of evangelize, the use of data in payments and how to make everyone's life easier at the end of the day.
Love it. Great stuff. Sebastian, thank you so much for taking time to be with us.
Thank you so much.
Of course. Hey, pleasure. Thank you so much, Patty, James. It's been a pleasure. All right. Have a great one, guys.
So, Patty, since this episode really focuses on retention, I thought, well, why not talk about our sponsor, Valor Paytech, that is so focused on this. I actually had a conversation with their president recently, and we were talking about upcoming advertising things we're doing. And I said, what do you want us to focus on? And he said, you've got to talk about retention, because he said the ISOs that are using Valor, because of all of the bells and whistles with the omni-channel payments and the customer feedback loops and all these things they have, they're seeing increased retention. They're having an impact. Right?
I bet they are. And especially, you mentioned the customer feedback feature. Yes. I think that is so cool, because as a merchant, if I'm getting, middle of the road, accolades, I'm, that's like a
alarm bell,
news alert, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And it's a lot better than waiting for somebody to dish you on Facebook or something, right? I mean, and you can see that. And I love as a merchant, I love the idea that, oh, Patty, you weren't satisfied? Here, let me give you your free cup of coffee.
Exactly. And so it's like pairing that text marketing, now all of a sudden you come into that merchant and they're thinking, I've got hundreds of text message, numbers in my account with Valor, which is this particular ISO. They're not going to switch as easily. It's going to be a big decision for them to switch. So I think the stickiness is so crucial. And again, I love what Valor is doing, because it's not, we talk a lot about point of sale and integrated payments, all these big picture things, which are great. Right. But a lot of merchants are smaller, and you need to retain them as well. Don't say, well, they're small, I'll just give them a regular old terminal, who cares? No, like we just talked about Sebastian, don't do that. Right? They're
going to become, if you play your cards right, they're going to become bigger accounts.
Absolutely. So head over to ccsalespro.com/Valor, VALOR, ccsalespro.com/VALOR. Fill out the form, get a free demo, learn more about Valor Paytech.
And now, here is Questions from the Field with James Shepard.
So, Patty, today I'm going to talk about the most underrated component of agent compensation. And spoiler alert, it is retention. All right, so I got to talk about retention as it relates to agent compensation. So when I knew that we were going to be interviewing Sebastian, I thought about what I could talk about that would complement that a bit. And, again, I think our interview that we just had was fantastic.
Fantastic.
Thought it was so intriguing. And to me, I love living in the age that we live in today. I just totally embrace it. As a processing company, do you realize what he just said? Like, you can do a data dump and send it to this guy, And
Right.
he will return a list of merchants that are likely to cancel. I mean, seriously.
I mean, how cool is that, right? I mean,
Like,
and it's just sort of like, to me, it's like, wow, so what a cool new business opportunity that
right,
nobody, a couple of years ago would have even thought of.
right. So how does this relate to agents, individual agents and agent compensation? Well, I love how Sebastian actually kind of alluded to it because he was talking about, well, talk to your ISO, talk to your ISO. Well, talk to them about what? Well, here's the thing. I don't know how many agents out there I talk to who, when I ask them about, how do you like your processor relationship, right? Like, how, are you happy with your current processor? I don't think I have ever. Now, think about this. And I'm talking about, I've spoken to, I'm sure, 3,000 or 4,000 agents on the phone. Okay. I don't think an agent has ever mentioned retention when I ask about how they like their processing company. Now, in fairness, they've mentioned maybe service, the solutions that are provided and things like that. But it's
components of retention, right?
Yes, but they're not like directly thinking about the retention. And as you just heard with that interview, there are things that your processor, that your ISO, up the food chain, there are things that they can do that will dramatically increase the likelihood that you will retain your merchant accounts. Right? And, that is like, okay, I'm trying to put this in perspective. Okay. So if you take your retention from, retaining 80% to retaining 85%. Okay. The Schedule A, like to compare that, like you could probably get a Schedule A that was 2 or 3 cents higher with an extra 2 or 3 basis points of cost, and those would wash. Right. So I didn't run the exact numbers, but just doing some rough.
But something around there. Yeah, sure.
So like the idea is, as an agent, if your processor reached out to you and said, hey, we're going to take your Schedule A from 3 cents and 2 basis points to 5 cents and 5 basis points, you would be like hitting the roof. Like, are you kidding me? I'm going to leave instantly. Right. But one processor will come. You'll have 2 processors, right? One of them will say, we'll give you 3 cents and 3 basis points. The other one will say, we'll give you 3 cents and 2 basis points. And you say, well, I'll take the one with the 2 basis points. Or one says, we'll give you this percentage. The other one will give you a 5% better residual split. And yet what you don't seem to care about is that one of those companies loses 27% of their merchants a year.
Yeah.
And the other one loses 12 or 15.
Right.
Well, are you trying to build residual or not? If you're trying to build residual, the retention conversation is crucial when you think about your long-term compensation because of let me give you a couple of reasons why it's such a huge deal. There's the obvious one that everybody understands, which is, well, if I don't lose the customer, I keep the residual, right? But that's such a small part of it. Think about when you lose a merchant account, okay?
Right.
There's one of 2 ways that this happens. We have the walkers and the talkers, right? Everybody understands in customer service, you have walkers and talkers. The walkers are the ones who just leave. Well, if your processing company is not alerting you that, hey, this merchant stopped processing, they haven't processed for the last 3 business days or whatever it is, if you can't set up alerts, how are you going to even know that happened? Right? And then by the time you get to them, well, guess what? They've already got a new point of sale system or whatever. Think about the kind of technology that's coming that Sebastian just talked about, where they could actually say, hey, this merchant hasn't called in, or maybe they did call in with an issue or whatever, but they haven't canceled yet. They haven't stopped processing, but they're more likely to cancel. So here are 7 merchants you might want to follow up on.
Yeah, sure.
Right? So that's crucial. But then I think even the biggest one is that when your ISO is not focused on retention, who has to be focused on retention?
You do.
You do, the agent. And so when the agent, when you're always worried, I sold for a processor one time, and, every time I would send, I knew a merchant had an issue, and the merchant would call in, and I would always be terrified, okay, I wonder how long they're going to be on the phone. I need to set an alarm because I need to call the merchant immediately after they're done on the phone so that I can fix whatever the processor did.
Right.
I would waste half a day on stuff like that.
Yeah, sure.
And it's like, I better drive over there because I know it, like literally it'd be like, well, I have a merchant, I'm making money on that merchant, and I know that right now they're on the phone with the processor. I should probably drive over there because I know when they get off the phone with the processor, they're going to be furious. You know, guess how long I stayed with that processor? Not very long.
Yeah, I bet.
Right?
I bet. Sure.
Why? Because that's my time. I mean, nothing is more valuable to a sales professional than their time.
Right.
You know?
I mean, you could be out selling another account in the time you wasted there. Sure.
Exactly. So I think, you know, what I would encourage our audience to do is, number one, if you're a company that has more than 3,000 bids, like what Sebastian just said, you know, start thinking about how can you make retention a higher priority, and how can you extend that priority to your agents? How can you give your agents and your smaller ISOs the data that they need, because they want it.
Right.
Those agents want it. I can't believe how many ISOs right now I guarantee you are thinking, James, there's no way I'm going to send a list of people that I want my agents to follow up on. Then they're not going to make sales that day. That's the dumbest thing ever.
So I mean, what good? I mean, it takes how many accounts to compensate for a lost account? You should be taking care of your accounts.
Right. And you should be like thinking that's a super profitable thing for your agent to do.
Yes.
And by the way, if you really feel that strongly about it, then build out a support team that actually cares about the merchants and have them reach out on the agent's behalf. But the idea is make it a higher priority, give the agents and the smaller ISOs visibility into that, right? And then for those of you that do that, let me give you a great piece of advice, okay? Maybe, just a side note, maybe you could mention that when you're recruiting people. No one ever mentions it. I'm always not blown away because everybody sucks at it.
But it's always the splits that they talk about. That's the, you know, how much money are you going to make? Right.
Create some data models. If you are one of the few ISOs that actually takes this seriously, and if you're retaining better than 80% a year, then you are good at this relative to our industry that's generally terrible at it. So maybe it's time for you to think about that a little bit and say, hey, wait a minute. We only lost 12% last year. Maybe we should do something about that to show agents. So a couple of pieces of advice there. Again, individual agents, start having these conversations. If you're a processing company, start thinking about making retention a priority, because ultimately retention is actually the most underrated component of agent compensation.
Excellent advice. Thanks, James.
This is the Insider's Report with Patty Murphy.
You know, James, while wiping down groceries and quarantining mail and wearing rubber gloves at the gas station, you know, things like this might be bygones of an earlier pandemic era, shall we say?
Sure.
You know, some changes ushered in by the pandemic are here to stay. You know, especially in the payments arena, and especially as it pertains to digital payments. And that's the upshot from the latest Global Back to Business study by Visa.
Okay.
It includes data collected in December 2021, 2,250 small business owners in about 9 countries. It also collected consumer data with interviews with 1,000 adults here in the U.S., 500 in the 8 other countries. So I think the consumer data is pretty pertinent for us. You know, so I just want to, it may seem like a lot of data, but just grab onto the pieces that make any difference for you, okay?
All right.
But I think this is interesting. 90% of SMBs are optimistic about the future of their businesses, which is the highest level of optimism Visa has recorded since it began the study 6 years ago.
Really?
Yeah.
That is exceedingly surprising to me. But okay.
Isn't it? That's what blew my mind.
I'm optimistic, but I didn't know.
I'm optimistic too, but I didn't think everybody else was.
That's great. Okay, good. That's a good number to start with.
54% viewed last year as an opportunity and reported their businesses were doing well heading into the new year, up from 46% in the summer of 2021.
Okay.
82% said they plan to accept some form of digital payment option this year. Not surprising there.
No, wait. I'm sorry. Hold on. Say that again. What was that number?
82% of SMBs plan to accept some form of digital payment option in 2022.
Digital payment meaning
that, by that means like contactless or e-wallets, or digital wallets. Even crypto would fall into that.
So this is they're looking to accept a form of payment other than someone swiping or keying in a credit card.
Exactly.
Well, that's actually a really high number. Okay, all right, interesting.
Yeah. Okay. In fact, 73% see accepting new forms of payment as fundamental to their business growth.
Wow.
Again,
that's a great number. Yeah.
it's a great number. And I think that you look at it like people like you and I, for example, who don't like to swipe our cards anymore.
Yeah.
If I can't, with you, if you can't do your watch or your
Pay.
phone, with
Right.
me, if I can't do my card, just tap it.
Right.
I'm not happy.
Right.
You know?
Yep. Absolutely.
So here's an interesting, among SMBs with an online presence, 90% agreed their survival through the pandemic was due to increased efforts to sell online.
Okay.
That's pretty logical.
That makes sense.
50% plan to increase cross-border sales in 2022. And I think this goes again to the pandemic, to e-commerce. I, for one, find that I'm buying more often from, I'm online looking for something, and I don't realize it's a European merchant until I get to checkout, right? It's like pounds, euros, dollars. Oh, this is somebody in Europe,
Right.
So I thought that was real. I thought those were really interesting. And then here's some of the consumer cashless plans. More than half of consumers surveyed, about 53%, expect to shift to being completely cashless within 10 years.
Yeah, I'm surprised it's that low, but yeah, that sounds about right.
Yeah. And again, that's a generational thing,
Of course, yeah.
People my age are a little less likely. People your age are a little bit more likely.
Right. People younger than me are much more likely. So yeah.
Much more likely. 25% said it will happen within the next 2 years.
Wow.
And 16% already are just using cashless payment methods.
Yep. That's me.
Yeah, exactly. And I thought that here's another little interesting thing, as for the SMBs, 64% expect to shift exclusively to, new forms of payment, non-cash, non-touch payments in 10 years.
Right.
41% said they expect to do it in 2 years.
Wow.
Which, again, and now back to the consumers. And this I thought was really interesting. Not totally surprising, but I'd love to see a number attached to it. 41% of consumers surveyed said they had abandoned a purchase in a physical store because digital payments were not accepted. And this is especially true of younger consumers. Among Gen Z, it was 59%. Your generation, it was, the millennials, it was 55%. And the boomers, 19%. Not a whole lot of surprise there,
Right.
Not all boomers are as hip and modern as me.
Well, of course, Patty, you're the trendsetters for your generation.
That's right. I always remember the first time I started using electronic bill pay was like in the early to mid 80s. And and I had a dentist at the time, and I had set him up, and of course a lot of people, they were basically doing check and list in those days,
right?
But so they would, my vendors would get this check from, it was check free at the time, which is now part of Fiserv and all that. But
Right.
I remember I had my dentist took me aside and he said, "Are you in trouble?" And I'm like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Am I getting that check from like some kind of like bankruptcy, some kind of debt consolidation?"
Oh, right. He thought they were taking all your money and just paying your bills for you.
Right?
So much debt. That's fun.
And of course now, I mean, everybody's doing it.
Yeah.
So,
wow.
but anyway, I just thought those were some really interesting statistics that could keep people, thinking in terms of where to go with their, It's really important to be selling things like contactless and wallet acceptance, etc.
Yeah, love it. Great stuff, Patty. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Merchant Sales Podcast. Whether you are an industry veteran, processing executive, or just trying to learn about the payment space, we appreciate your time. The Merchant Sales Podcast is a joint production of Greensheet.com and ccsalespro.com. And we hope you will tune in next week for more information and tips on building your merchant services business.